Stay quiet, follow me, the maid whispered. Her voice trembled. Alejandro Moretti stopped on the stone steps. He adjusted the gold watch on his wrist. It was his father's watch. He wore it every morning. His phone was in his other hand. His driver, Enzo, was supposed to wait by the black Mercedes. The family council was scheduled in 42 minutes. He had no time for whispers. He turned toward the sound. It was the new housekeeper, Allie Carter. She had been in the house for 2 months. She was 27 years old. She was always quiet. She always looked at the floor. Now, she stood at the servants' passage. Her cheeks were pale. Her hands shook at her sides. "Sir, please stay quiet, follow me." Alejandro stopped. His voice remained hard. "I am late. What is this?" She stepped closer. Her hand closed around his sleeve. Her grip surprised him. It was not the grip of a maid. It was the grip of a desperate woman. "Please, 2 minutes. If I am wrong, punish me. If I am right, you live." He looked down at her hand. He could have shaken her off. He did not. The word live made him pause. Not survive. Not escape. Live. She pulled him sideways behind a decorative wall. The moss brushed his suit. He looked toward the gate. The Mercedes waited. The driver stood by the door. Something was wrong. The driver was not Enzo. Enzo was 48, with broad shoulders. This man was younger and shorter. His jaw was tight. His eyes darted nervously. The driver wore a tailored coat. The left hip bulged unnaturally. It was the exact shape of a hidden holster. The engine was silent. That was the third sign. Enzo always kept the engine running. Warm engines meant fast escapes. The engine had never been off before. Alejandro's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. "Isabella," it read. He answered on the second ring. "My love," she said. Her voice was sweet like honey. "The car is waiting. The road is clear. That meeting is important." Alejandro looked at the housekeeper. Allie shook her head once. He had walked out of this door thousands of times. This was the first time he hid from it. He ended the call. The screen went dark. Allie reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out an old phone. The screen was cracked. The case was held together by clear tape. "Sir," she whispered. "Yesterday morning, I cleaned the west wing. The library door was open. I heard voices." Alejandro did not move. He did not breathe. Senorita Isabella was inside with Senior Damien. Damien Ritchie was 31. Alejandro had pulled him from a portside accountant office. He had trusted him like a brother. Allie pressed the cracked screen. A tiny sound came from the speaker. It was Damien's voice. Calm and chilling. "The council meeting is the moment. Enzo will not be there. My man drives. He goes into the tunnel and never comes out. You inherit as the fiancée in mourning. I take the seat as advisor. 6 months from now, we marry. The empire is ours." Then came Isabella's voice. Warm, private, and smiling. He never suspects because he trusts you. 15 years of trust. That is the beauty of it. The recording clicked off. Alejandro Moretti did not rage. He did not shout. He became terrifyingly still, like deep water before a drop falls. The gold watch ticked against the stone. Ali whispered, "There is more. But we have no time." His phone vibrated again. "Gamian," the screen displayed. He answered, "Boss, everything is set. Enzo called in sick. The replacement is trusted. Move." Alejandro exhaled slowly. "On my way." He ended the call. He looked at Ali. "Show me what you have." 2 minutes ago, he was a king. Now, a cracked phone in a maid's hand kept him alive. She gestured toward the narrow servant's door. "This way, sir." Quietly. He followed her into the cool shadows. They passed the kitchen. The cook did not look up. That habit saved her life today. They climbed a narrow staircase. They reached a small, unused stone balcony. It faced the private rose courtyard. Alejandro stepped forward. Below in the sunlight stood Isabella. She wore her familiar linen dress. Standing close beside her was Damien. He rested his hand on her hip. She adjusted his shirt collar with practiced ease. "After today," Damien murmured, "we do not hide." Isabella tilted her head back. She smiled. "I hate waiting, but I have waited well. For 15 years, I played the future lady. I want the title to be real." She lifted her left hand. The diamond ring caught the light. She laughed softly. "This will look better on my hand when he is dead." Damien kissed her forehead. They walked away in opposite directions. On the balcony above, Alejandro's knuckles turned white. His hand crushed the stone railing. He looked down at his own life turning to ash. He turned to Ali. "Who is with you at home?" "Only my little sister, sir." "Emma, she is 8 years old." Alejandro nodded slowly. He had to protect 2 people now. He had less than an hour to become a monster. He led her deeper into the mansion, past the pantry, to a heavy wooden door disguised as a wine cellar. He pressed his palm against the panel. A hidden latch clicked. They descended into the basement. Bare stone walls. A single steel safe. No cameras. No listeners. The only safe room left in the estate. He locked the door behind them. "Sit." Ali sat. She placed the cracked phone on the desk. She pressed play again. 11 minutes of cold betrayal played out. The Eastern Tunnel Trap. The shell companies in Luxembourg. The Swiss accounts. The fake grief. The 15-year-long con. Alejandro listened without blinking. When it ended, he walked to the safe. He opened it with a hidden code. He pulled out 2 items. His father's heavy steel service pistol and a secure satellite phone. He turned to Ali. "You understand what this means?" She met his eyes steadily. "It means as I go home, they will find me. And Emma will be alone." "That will not happen," Alejandro said. "Not while I breathe." He dialed a number he had not used in 18 months. It rang 3 times. An old, gravelly voice answered. "Marco?" "I am coming," Marco Vitali said. The line went dead. Alandaro set the phone down. He gave Ali her instructions. Then he made 3 ordinary phone calls. He postponed the council meeting. He told Enzo to hide. He canceled lunch. The trap was set. The war had begun. Ali did not lead him to the front door. She pulled him toward a side door, hidden behind thick ivy. "This way, sir. Please be quiet. There is something else you need to see." Alandaro followed her. He asked no questions. He moved like a stranger in his own house. A house he had walked through every day for 18 years. The servants' staircase was narrow and cool. The walls were made of rough, peeling plaster. The air smelled of old dust. They passed the back of the kitchen. The cook stood with her back to them. She was kneading dough. She did not look up. Not even once. That lifelong habit saved her life today. Ali led him upward, through another dim corridor. They stopped at a small, unused stone balcony on the 2nd floor. It faced the private rose courtyard. It was the place where Isabella read poetry every morning. Ali stopped before the railing. She did not step out. She waited in silence. Alandaro stepped forward. Below them in the bright sunlight stood Isabella. She wore her familiar pale linen dress. Her dark hair was loosely gathered at her neck. Standing close beside her was Damien. Too close for comfort. Too close for any innocent explanation. They were not embracing. That would have been easier to bear. That would look like a sudden, fiery mistake. This was far worse. This was ordinary. Damien rested his hand on Isabella's hip. It was the gesture of a husband of 20 years. Isabella raised her hand, not to push him away. She adjusted the collar of his shirt with practiced ease. Her fingers moved smoothly. It was a small task done hundreds of times before, in a house that did not belong to him. After today, Damien murmured softly, "We do not have to hide anymore." Isabella tilted her head back to look at him. She smiled. It was a smile Alejandro had never seen. "I hate waiting," she said. "But I have waited, well, for 15 years. I played the future lady of the Moretti house. I want the title to be real." She lifted her left hand toward the sunlight. The diamond ring Alejandro had given her flashed brightly. She turned the ring slowly on her finger. She laughed, a low, private laugh. "This will look better on my hand when he is dead." Damien leaned forward. He pressed his lips lightly to her forehead. Then they separated and walked away in opposite directions. On the balcony above, Alejandro Moretti did not move. He did not breathe. His right hand rested on the cold stone railing. Slowly, his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Ali said nothing. She understood the silence. It was the silence of a life ending in a single second. After a long moment, Alejandro turned his head. "Who is with you at home?" he asked. "Who comes looking for you if I keep you here?" Ali hesitated. Her fingers tightened on her apron. Only my little sister, sir. Emma. She is 8 years old. Alejandro nodded slowly. He had to protect 2 people now. He had less than an hour to become someone dangerous enough to do it. Alejandro turned away from the balcony. He did not look at the corridor again. Some sights only need to be seen once. He gestured for Ali to follow. They went back down the servants' stair, past the kitchen, past the pantry, to the end of a side corridor, a door that looked like a wine cellar. Alejandro pressed his palm against the dark wood panel. A hidden mechanism clicked deep within the wall. The heavy door opened. It revealed a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The room at the bottom was small and bare. Stone walls, a wooden desk, a single steel safe built into the wall. No windows, no cameras, no listening devices. It was the only room in the estate that belonged to Alejandro alone. He closed the door behind them and locked it. Sit. Ali sat down. He placed her cracked phone in the center of the desk with both hands, like something fragile and precious. Then she pressed play. 11 minutes of audio filled the small room. Damien's calm, chilling voice laid out the plan. The Eastern Tunnel, the disabled security camera, the fake kidnapping, the paper mill hideout, the forged signatures for the Swiss accounts. Then Isabella's voice came through, clear and smiling. Why not just kill him at once? Because if he dies here, the police open the walls. If he vanishes on the road, rivals take the blame. The story writes itself. The story protects us. The recording clicked off. Alejandro stood up from the desk. He did not speak a single word. He walked to the safe in the wall. He entered a code Ali could not see. He pulled out 2 things: his father's heavy steel pistol and a secure satellite phone. He turned to Ali. You heard all of it. Do you understand what this means for you? Ali met his gaze. Her voice was steady. It means if I go home tonight, they will find me, and Emma will be alone. Alejandro looked at her for a long moment. That will not happen, he said quietly. Not while I breathe. He picked up the satellite phone. He dialed a number he had not used in 18 months. It rang 3 times. On the 4th, an old steady voice answered. Marco. I am coming, Marco Vitali said. The line went dead. Alejandro set the satellite phone down. He looked at Ali. It was time to build the trap. Marco Vitalis stood in the doorway, the oldest captain in the family. Marco brought him through the servants' door at 2 in the morning. Lorenzo was 60. He carried a heavy leather bag with both hands. He set it on the desk and opened it. It was packed with banded euros. Damien came to me 8 weeks ago, Lorenzo said. He put this on my kitchen table. He said I would take the advisor's seat when the transition happened. He did not name the transition. He did not need to. Lorenzo looked into Alejandro's eyes. I took the money because refusing meant death. But I never spent a coin. It belongs to you, Padrino. It always did. Alejandro looked at the bag. You are still your father's son, Marco told Lorenzo. Over the next 2 days, the counterattack took shape. Lorenzo brought in 4 more loyal captains. Enzo returned in secret from Como. Traitors, like Vito and Salvatore, were placed under silent surveillance. The trap was simple. Alejandro would announce a high-level council meeting at the old villa. 3 mornings from now, he would ride in the black Mercedes. He would leave at the exact same time. Damien's route through the eastern tunnel would be honored. The man inside the car, however, would not be Alejandro. It would be a retired officer, wearing Alejandro's spare suit. Alejandro and Lorenzo would follow 3 minutes behind in an armored SUV. On the second afternoon, Marco drove Ali south to Amalfi. She returned an hour later with a small silver butterfly necklace. Emma had sent it. That evening, Marco set up a laptop in the basement. Emma appeared on the screen. She wore the silver butterfly around her neck. "My sister said you are a good man," Emma said. "She said you are quiet, but your eyes are not cold. She said people whose eyes are not cold are usually good inside." Alejandro cleared his throat. "Please keep my sister safe," Emma added. "She is the only one I have." "I will," Alejandro said. "I promise." The screen went dark. Alejandro sat in the lamplight for a long time. At 8 in the morning, Alejandro stepped onto the stone steps, the same steps where a maid grabbed his sleeve 4 days ago. He wore the same black suit, the same gold watch. Isabella stood in the doorway, in a cream silk robe. She held a cup of coffee. "Come home for lunch," she said. Alejandro turned. He kissed her cheek. He tasted the coffee on her lips. "I will try." He walked down the steps. Damien stood by the car. "The meeting begins at 9:30, Padrino." "I know," Alejandro said quietly. He got into the car. Inside sat the decoy. They exchanged a single, silent nod. The door closed. Alejandro slipped out the far door into the alley. The armored SUV was waiting. Lorenzo was at the wheel. The war was about to begin. The Mercedes moved forward. Damien watched it leave. He did not know the truth. The man he wanted dead was 300 meters behind him. 3 minutes passed. The Mercedes entered the eastern tunnel. The tunnel was dark. The concrete was wet. Halfway through, the brake lights flared. 2 black vans slid across the road behind it. A third van blocked the exit ahead. 6 men in dark coats stepped out. Rifles were raised. The armored SUV rounded the curve. It stopped hard. The doors opened. Aelia moved instantly. Lorenzo's men fanned out against the wall. They used concrete columns for cover. The gunfight started. Shots echoed in the narrow space. Concrete dust filled the air. 4 ambushers fell in 10 seconds. 2 Jupiter rifles grazed their heads. The decoy crouched behind the car. He did not fire. Alejandro walked for the snake. Grabbed the decoy by the collar. He pressed his feathers pistol to the man's throat. "Wait." The man wept. Damien, Richard, Isabella, Pete, $500,000. The satellite puked by Maid. Alejandro is without weather was game. Uncle says case. Tight
until Padre Nocturnian left the mansion 2 minutes after the dawn. He never meant it. Isabella was dying. Her past is it. Alejandro stood in his room. He listened to his he said quietly, 5 o'clock. He worked the cage. She got the connections straight on to the cell.
Back at the mansion, the trap shifted. Damian and Isabella abandoned the game. They had forged passports. They had stolen cash from the West Wing safe. They knew the tunnels had failed. They needed a new leverage point. In the staff kitchen, Allie poured a cup of tea. She did not know the danger. She thought of her sister in Amalfi. She thought of the blue vial. A car pulled into the alley behind the service entrance. 2 men stepped out, but they did not knock. They kicked the kitchen door in. Allie dropped her cup. It shattered on the floor. She turned to run. A heavy hand grabbed her arm. "Going somewhere?" a rough voice asked. Allie fought back. She kicked. She scratched. She bit the hand that held her. The man cursed and struck her face. She hit the cold tile floor. Blood smeared on her lip. She looked up with defiance. "You will never win," she whispered. The man pulled her up by her hair. "We do not need to win. We just need you." They dragged her toward the waiting car. The engine roared to life. The car vanished into the Naples traffic. At the Amalfi villa, Marco received the call. His face turned to stone. He looked at little Emma playing by the roses. "They took her," Marco muttered. He dialed Alejandro's number. "Padrino," Marco said. "They took Allie." Silence hung on the line. It was the silence of a dormant volcano. Alejandro did not shout. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Track the phone. Find the car. Burn the city down if you have to." "I am coming home." The hunt had truly begun. The sedan pulled away. It vanished into the narrow streets of Naples. Inside the quiet apartment, chaos reigned. Emma was crying. Her small hands clutched her face. Old Rosa stood pinned against the wall. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The door was broken off its hinge. Dust floated in the afternoon light. Emma's stuffed rabbit lay on the floor. One of its ears was folded over. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Heavy. Rushed. Marco Vitali burst into the apartment. His hand rested on his weapon. His eyes scanned the empty rooms. Rosa grabbed his coat. They took her. They took Allie. Marco looked down at the old woman. He looked at the frightened child. He knelt before Emma. He kept his voice steady. "Where is your sister?" "They put her in a car," Rosa gasped. "A silver car." Heading toward the industrial district. Marco stood up. He spoke into his satellite phone. "Padrino, they have her. We have a vehicle match." On the other line. Silence fell. A terrifying, suffocating silence. Alejandro Moretti stood in the Amalfi villa. His hand gripped the phone. The knuckles turned white. "Where?" "The old industrial belt by the river. The abandoned paper mill. The one with the 40-meter chimney." Alejandro did not hesitate. "Gather the men." "All of them. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn that mill to ash." He ended the call. He reached inside his jacket. He checked his father's pistol. He placed Emma's blue vial in his pocket. The hunt had reached its final stage. Damien stood inside the dark basement of the mill. A single bulb hung from a wire. It cast harsh shadows on the concrete walls. Allie was tied to a metal chair. Nylon rope cut into her wrists. Her jaw ached where she had been struck. The air smelled of rust and damp paper. Isabella stood 3 steps away. Her makeup was smeared. Her pearl necklace looked dead against her skin. "Do you know what you are?" Isabella sneered. "You are just a maid, a little girl who scrubs floors. And you ruined everything I built." Allie raised her head. Her eyes were clear and unafraid. "You built nothing. You only stood beside a man who did. That is why you hate me." Isabella raised her hand. She struck Allie across the face. Allie's head snapped to the side. She did not cry out. She looked back with unbroken defiance. Damien walked in from the corridor. "Enough," he said softly. "We do not need to break her face. We need to break him." Damien pulled out his phone. He dialed a number. It rang once. "Paterino," Damien said. 30 million euros. A Cayman account. 2 hours. If not, your new favorite girl comes back on pieces." Alejandro's voice came through the speaker, cold as Arctic ice. "Listen to me, Damien. I am coming. And when I get there, no amount of money will save you." Damien laughed. He ended the call. He looked at Isabella. "He is coming alone, or with a few fools. Either way, he walks into our trap." Outside, the engines roared. The armored vehicles arrived in the dark. Men in black tactical gear poured out. Lorenzo took the front gate. Enzo secured the rear loading dock. Alejandro moved down the narrow side stair. The basement was just below. The final reckoning was moments away. The basement was cold. The walls leaked water. A single bulb swung from a rusted wire. It cast long, sharp shadows across the floor. Allie sat on a steel chair. Her hands were bound behind her back. Nylon rope cut deep into her skin. Blood dried dark upon her lip. She did not flinch. She did not cry. Her eyes were fixed on the door. Damien stood in the corner. He held a glass of cheap whiskey. He swirled the amber liquid slowly. "You have spirit, little maid," Damien murmured. "Too bad spirit does not buy bread. Or freedom." Allie raised her chin. Her voice was steady. "You are already dead. You just do not know the date yet." Damien laughed. A short, sharp sound. He stepped forward. The back of his hand struck her cheek. The impact echoed in the damp room. Allie's head jerked to the side. A thin line of red trickled down her chin. She turned her face back. She looked him straight in the eye. "Hit me again. It changes nothing. He is coming." Damien's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. He threw his glass against the wall. Glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Let him come. I have 30 million in the Swiss accounts, and I have her throat." Heavy footsteps echoed from the upper stair. Slow, measured, unmistakable. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A shadow fell across the concrete steps. Alandro Moretti stepped down. He wore his black overcoat. His face was carved from granite. His eyes were colder than winter ice. Damien drew his pistol. He grabbed Allie by the hair. He pressed the cold steel barrel against her temple. "Stop right there, Padrino. One more step and she dies." Alandro stopped. He did not raise his hands. He did not plead. He looked at Damien the way a judge looks at a corpse. "You took the wrong person, Damien. You stole the wrong life." Damien's hand shook slightly. 30 million euros. Sign the transfer now. Alandro reached into his pocket. He pulled out a slim silver drive. He held it out. "It is here. Let her go." Isabella stepped out from the shadows. Her face was twisted with fury. "Kill her anyway, Damien. Kill them both. Take everything." Damien's finger tightened on the trigger. He looked at the silver drive. He looked at Alejandro. He grinned. "A wise choice, Padrino." He reached out his free hand to grab the drive. In that fraction of a second, the air tore apart. A silenced crack echoed from the upper shadows. Lorenzo stood on the metal catwalk. His rifle was leveled. The bullet caught Damien's right shoulder. Blood sprayed across the damp wall. Damien screamed and dropped his gun. Allie threw her weight forward. She slammed her chair against the concrete. The wooden legs splintered. She rolled free of the binding ropes. Alandro moved like lightning. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He grabbed Damien by the throat. He slammed him against the iron pillar. The metal groaned under the impact. 15 years, Alandro whispered. 15 years of trust. Damien gasped for air. His fingers clawed at Alandro's wrists. "Padrino, mercy. There is no mercy for traitors," Alandro said. He did not use a gun. His bare hands finished the work. Damien's body went limp. Alandro dropped him onto the bloody floor. Isabella backed away. Her eyes widened in absolute terror. She tripped over the shattered glass. She hit the ground hard. She looked up at Alandro. Her voice trembled. "Alandro, we were together? We were supposed to." Alandro looked down at her. His face did not change. "You were a mistake," he said quietly. "And now the room is clean." He turned away. He walked over to Allie. He knelt beside her. He cut the remaining ropes from her wrists with a small pocket knife. "Can you stand?" he asked. Allie rubbed her bruised wrists. She looked up to him. Her eyes were shining. "Yes, sir. Let's go home." The wind howled. It swept across the abandoned industrial flats. It carried the smell of old river mud and damp concrete. Isabella ran. Her heels clicked sharply against the metal staircase. Each step echoed in the cavernous framework of the mill. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her silk dress whipped around her legs. She pushed open the heavy steel door. She stepped out onto the vast flat roof. Above her hung a bruised twilight sky. Below her stretched the dark, forgotten machinery of the yard. She reached the outer edge. The parapet was low and crumbling. She turned around. The heavy steel door creaked open again. Alandro Moretti stepped out onto the roof. He did not rush. His boots crunched softly on the gravel. He stopped 10 paces away. His hands were buried in his coat pockets. His expression was as cold as the iron surrounding them. Isabella pressed her back against the low wall. Her fingers clutched the rough stone. Her hair blew wildly across her face. "Stay back," she whispered. Her voice cracked in the wind. Alejandro did not stop. He took 2 slow steps forward. 15 years, Isabella. His voice cut cleanly through the gale. 15 years of anniversaries. 15 years of sitting at the same table. And all you saw was a chair to steal? Isabella laughed. It was a harsh, desperate sound. She threw her head back. "Steal? You think you own it all? You inherited a name. You inherited a throne built on blood you never spilled. I played the game better than you ever could." Alejandro stopped. He looked at her with profound detachment. "You played a game you did not understand. You thought betrayal was a strategy. It is only an exit." Isabella shook her head violently. Tears streamed down her painted cheeks. She took a half step forward. Her heel slipped on the loose gravel. She caught her balance with a sharp intake of breath. "You never loved me," she screamed. "Not for a single day. You were always looking through me, always waiting for someone worthy of your silence." Alejandro watched her. "Love was never part of your contract, Isabella. You wanted the ring. You wanted the title. You got both. Why wasn't that enough?" Isabella stared at him. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot. The madness in them was absolute. "Because you looked at me like I was a piece of furniture, a beautiful ornament in your fortress. I wanted to be the one who held the key." She took another step backward. Her heel met open air. The crumbling edge gave way under her weight. A shower of small stones fell into the dark abyss below. Isabella stumbled. Her arms flailed wildly in the wind. She caught a fleeting glimpse of the drop. Her face drained of all color. "Alejandro," she breathed. It was the first time in years she used his name without pretense. It was the voice of a terrified child. Alejandro did not move. Unless Bisenvais put. He did not reach out his hand. He watched her slide. Her fingers scratched desperately at the smooth concrete. There was nothing to hold, nothing to save. With a final, sharp gasp, she slipped over the edge. The wind swallowed her scream. Then came the heavy, dull impact far below. Silence reclaimed the roof. Alejandro stood alone at the precipice. He looked down into the dark courtyard. The wind tugged at the lapels of his coat. He reached up. He adjusted his gold watch. It ticked steadily against his wrist. He turned his back on the edge. He walked toward the door. The reckoning was complete. The snow fell in Zurich. It was white. It was clean. It covered the ancient streets in a silent blanket. The flakes drifted down from a heavy, silver-gray sky. They settled softly on the windowsills. They melted against the glass of the private clinic. Inside the building, the air was warm. It smelled of clean linen, antiseptic, and warm wool. The corridors were quiet. Only the sound of distant footsteps broke the stillness. The clock on the white wall ticked softly. Tick, tick, tick. Every second felt like an eternity. Every beat of the clock measured out a life waiting to begin. Allie sat on the wooden bench in the corridor. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Her fingers were interlaced so hard that her knuckles turned white. She wore a simple dark coat. Her hair was tied back with a black ribbon. She stared at the closed double doors of the operating room. The amber light above the door remained stubbornly lit. Red letters glowed inside the glass. IN surgery. 5 years of sleepless nights. 5 years of carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. 5 years of scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and trading her youth for a bottle of medicine. All of it boiled down to this single room, to this single hour, to a tiny, fragile heartbeat beating behind those heavy doors. Her breath came in shallow, controlled rhythms. She did not blink. Her eyes burned with a dry, relentless heat. Then, the amber light flickered. It turned off. The heavy sound of a mechanical latch echoed down the hall. The door swung open. Dr. Weiss stepped out of the operating room. She looked exhausted. Her hair was tucked messily beneath a blue surgical cap. Her forehead bore the faint impressions of a protective mask. Yet, as she pulled off her blue latex gloves and tossed them into a bin, her eyes told a different story. She looked tired. She looked victorious. Dr. Weiss walked slowly toward the bench. Her footsteps were heavy, but her posture was upright. Allie stood up so fast her knees nearly buckled. She did not speak. Her throat was completely dry. She only looked at the doctor's face, searching for a sign, a verdict, a final sentence. Dr. Weiss stopped 2 paces away. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of her mouth. "The surgery was a success," she said. Her voice was soft, cutting cleanly through the sterile silence of the hallway. "Her heart is strong. She will live a long life." The words washed over Allie like a tidal wave. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. The ticking of the clock vanished. The sterile smell of the clinic faded. The invisible mountain that had crushed her chest for half a decade simply dissolved into nothingness. Allie's knees gave way. She caught herself against the wooden armrest of the bench. A single tear broke free from her lashes. It tracked hot and fast down her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed since the night in the kitchen. Not a tear of sorrow, not a tear of fear, a tear of absolute, crushing release. "Thank you," Allie whispered. Her voice cracked. "Thank you, doctor." Dr. Weiss placed a warm hand on Allie's shoulder. "Go wash your face," the doctor said gently. "She is resting. You can see her in 20 minutes. The heavy double doors swung open again. A nurse pushed a narrow hospital bed out of the operating room. The wheels rolled silently across the polished linoleum floor. Emma lay in the center of the bed. She looked terribly small beneath the white blankets. Her face was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. Her eyes were closed. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. In and out. In and out. It was the rhythm of a normal child, a rhythm unburdened by a broken heart. Around her neck, outside the hospital gown, rested the small silver butterfly necklace. It caught the light of the corridor and flashed a brilliant silvery gleam. Allie walked beside the bed. She followed the nurse down the corridor, toward the recovery ward. Her hand reached out. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the white blanket. She did not want to let go. They reached the recovery room. The nurse locked the wheels of the bed in place and quietly stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The room was warm and smelled of lavender and fresh snow. Allie pulled a chair close to the bedside. She sat down. She took Emma's tiny, cold hand in both of her own. She brought her sister's knuckles to her lips. She kissed them softly. "You are safe now," Allie whispered against her skin. "You are going to grow up. You are going to see the sun." Emma did not stir. She only breathed, deeply, peacefully. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the quiet streets of Zurich. The afternoon light faded into a soft, bruised twilight. A black car waited on the cobblestone street below the clinic window. Its engine was silent. The exhaust puffed small white clouds into the freezing air. Alejandro Moretti stood by the open rear door of the vehicle. He wore his dark wool overcoat. The collar was turned up against the wind. He held a large black umbrella, shielding the doorway from the falling flakes. He did not look at his watch. He did not look at the city. His eyes were fixed entirely on the glass doors of the clinic. The sliding glass doors parted with a soft hiss. Allie walked out into the cold alpine air. She took a deep breath. The freezing wind hit her face. It felt wonderful. It felt alive. She wore her dark coat and the black scarf she had worn every day since leaving Naples. She walked down the stone steps toward the car. Alejandro stepped forward. He closed the umbrella and tossed it onto the seat. He did not offer a grand gesture. He did not offer empty words. He looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes that had once terrified a city. "How is she?" Alejandro asked. His voice was low, steady, and warm. "She is sleeping," Allie said. Her voice was calm. "Dr. Weiss said her heart is strong. She asked for you before they brought her out." Alejandro nodded slowly. "Then we will visit her tomorrow before we leave." "We?" Allie asked, her eyebrows lifting slightly. Alejandro opened the car door wider. "Unless you prefer to stay here in the snow." Allie looked back at the glowing windows of the clinic. Then she looked at the man standing beside the car. The man who had burned an empire to the ground because someone dared to touch what belonged to him. She smiled. A small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "No," Allie said. "I have seen enough snow." They stood together by the window of the private recovery room later that evening. Below them, the city lights of Zurich flickered to life one by one. The streets looked like rivers of gold rolling through the white darkness. Alejandro rested his hands on the wooden sill. He did not look at Allie. His gaze remained fixed on the glittering city below. "You do not have to go back to Naples as a maid," Alejandro said quietly. "The house is yours if you want it. Not the keys to the pantry. The keys to the estate." Allie turned her head. She looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the silver threads starting to show at his temples. "I know," Allie replied. "Then what will you do? Will you live in the north? Will you take the money and buy a house by the sea, like you always dreamed?" Allie turned away from the window. She walked toward the small table where a vase of white lilies stood. She touched a petal with her index finger. "Dreams change, Mr. Moretti," she said softly. "Or perhaps they simply grow up." Alejandro turned his head. He looked at her. "And what has yours grown into?" Allie looked back into his eyes. The eyes that had once frozen men in their tracks. The eyes that now held only a quiet, profound stillness. "I will stay," Allie said. Her voice did not waver. "Not as a servant. Not as a guest who owes a debt. As someone who helps you keep the house standing, Alejandro did not speak for a long moment. The room was completely silent save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping child in the bed. Then, a rare, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile that transformed his entire face. It erased the scars of the past 15 years. It wiped away the blood, the betrayal, and the ash. "The house is already clean," he said. "The floors do not need scrubbing anymore." "Then we will build something new in it," Ali answered. "Something that does not need walls made of stone." Back in Naples, the spring sun broke over the old stone estate. The storm clouds had vanished completely. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. The roses in the private courtyard bloomed early this year. Their red petals caught the morning light, shining like drops of fresh dew. The blood had washed away from the courtyards. The bullet holes in the western wall had been plastered and painted over. The traitors were gone. Vito and Salvatore were breaking stones in the southern quarries. Damian was nothing more than a bad memory buried in an unmarked grave. Isabella was a shadow swept away by the wind off the roof. The empire of the Moretti family had not fallen. It had shed its old skin. In the garden, Alejandro walked down the gravel path. His hands were no longer buried in his coat pockets. They hung naturally at his sides. Ali walked beside him. She wore a simple, cream-colored dress. The sun warmed her shoulders. Emma was recovering in the sunroom, her laughter echoing faintly through the open windows as she played with a new set of paints. Alejandro and Ali walked in silence. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of suspicion. It was the comfortable silence of two people who had survived the dark and reached the other side. As they turned the corner by the large stone fountain, their hands brushed. The back of his hand touched her fingers. Neither of them pulled away. Instead, Ali shifted her hands slightly. Her fingers slid between his. She held his hand. Firmly. Warmly. Alejandro closed his fingers around hers. He did not look down. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The path that led toward the house. Toward the future. Toward a life that finally belonged to both of them. The empire of shadows had not fallen. It had simply learned how to breathe. The morning air in Naples was sharp. It carried the scent of salt. It carried the scent of burning cedar. Alejandro Moretti stood at the high balcony of the primary villa. His coat was unbuttoned. His gaze swept across the sweeping lawns below. The guards were different now. No longer faceless thugs in soup suits. Trained professionals. Men loyal to the bloodline and the code. Ali stepped out onto the stone terrace. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer. Her hair was pinned back, sharp and severe. No trace of the maid remained. Only the cold, unyielding shadow of a commander. "The regional directors are waiting in the subterranean bunker," Ali said. Her voice was level. "Let them dead another 10 minutes," Alejandro replied without turning. "Letting them sweat builds compliance. They're already sweating," Ali said. A faint, sharp smile touched her lips. "Word of what happened in Zurich reached the south before our private jet landed. They know Damien's fate. They know Isabella's fate. They know what happens to those who mistake mercy for weakness." Alejandro turned. He looked down at her. The distance between them had vanished months ago. Now, they were two blades forged in the same fire. "You enjoy this," Alejandro noted. "I enjoy control," Ali corrected. "A clean house requires constant sweeping." "Then let us go sweep," Alejandro said. They walked down the spiraling iron staircase. Each step echoed against the cold stone walls. The subterranean vault was vast, reinforced concrete, bulletproof glass partitions. 12 men sat around the heavy mahogany table. The 12 capos of the Southern Syndicate. Men who had ruled through fear for decades. As Alejandro and Ali entered, the room went death silent. Not a single chair scraped. Not a single breath hitched. Every eye dropped instantly to the floor. Alejandro pulled out the central leather chair. He did not sit. He remained standing, his hands resting flat on the dark wood. Ali took the seat to his immediate right. An equal seat, an equal voice. "You receive the new ledgers," Alejandro said. His voice was low, carrying effortlessly across the hollow vault. No one answered. A heavy, suffocating pressure filled the room. "Vito is in the quarries," Alejandro continued. "Salvatore is breaking rocks until his hands bleed. Does anyone here feel the urge to join them?" Silence stretched. A thick, suffocating wall of terror. Finally, a heavy capo named Moretti, no relation, a distant cousin of the old guard, cleared his throat. "Padrino," the man rasped. "The restructuring, it cuts deep. The old routes are closed. The port tariffs have doubled. If they squeeze the syndicates too hard, they will break." Alejandro did not blink. He did not raise his voice. "Let them break. We are no longer street pushers. We are an institution." The capo's face darkened. He looked toward Ali, as if searching for a weakness. A woman, a former servant, a fragile entry point into the throne. And the girl? The capo sneered softly, thinking his whisper would pass. "The maid who turned the padrino's head. Does she dictate the policy of the Moretti bloodline now?" The air in the room vanished. Before Alejandro could move, Ali's hand struck the mahogany table. Bang! The sound cracked like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Ali stood up. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the capo. Cold. Deadly. Absolute. "I do not dictate policy," Ali said, her voice dropping into an icy register that sent shivers down the spines of hardened killers. "I enforce it." She slid a heavy manila folder across the table. It stopped inches from the capo's trembling fingers. The man opened it. His face turned the color of ash. Inside were bank records, encrypted text messages, flight manifests to Marseille, proof of a secret meeting with Desmayens' surviving loyalists held less than 48 hours ago. "You thought you were clever," Ali whispered, walking slowly around the table toward him. "You thought because the blood was washed from the courtyard the slate was wiped clean. You thought I was still holding a rag and a bucket." The capo tried to stand. His legs shook. 2 armed guards materialized behind his chair, their heavy hands pressing him back down into the leather. "Alejandro," the man choked out, looking frantically toward the head of the table. "Padrino, I am family." Alejandro raised his right hand. 2 fingers. A simple, definitive gesture. "You were family," Alejandro said coldly. "Now you are an expense." Ali stopped beside the capo's chair. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear. "Clean the house," she murmured, echoing his own words back to him. starting with you." The guards moved with mechanical precision. The heavy oak doors opened. The capo was dragged out into the corridor, his boots scraping helplessly against the stone. The remaining 11 men stared straight ahead. None of them dared to blink. None of them dared to breathe. Alejandro sat down slowly in his chair. He looked at Ali. There was no shock in his eyes, only deep, unyielding respect. The kind of respect only earned by those who stand in the fire and refuse to burn. "The meeting is adjourned," Alejandro said. The 11 capos stood up in unison. They bowed their heads. They backed out of the room one by one like priests leaving an altar. Within seconds, the vault was empty. Only the 2 of them remained. The heavy steel doors sealed shut with a hydraulic hiss. Ali let out a slow, controlled breath. She reached down, unbuttoning her blazer slightly, the sharp tension draining from her shoulders. Alejandro walked over to her. He reached out. His thumb brushed the side of her cheek, right where the faint shadow of an old bruise used to be. Now, there was nothing. Only smooth, perfect skin. Only a queen standing beside her king. "You handled that well," Alejandro said. "I learned from the best," Ali replied, leaning slightly into his touch. "The house is clean. For now," Ali smiled. "Then we have time," Alejandro said. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, exactly as they had done in the garden. "Time for what?" "Time to build something that outlives us both." They turned away from the empty table. They walked out of the vault, up the stone stairs, and back toward the light. The shadows did not threaten them anymore. The shadows belonged to them.